This was never just about a roster spot. It wasn't just about 12 names on a graphic. It wasn't just about rotations, minutes, or earning your turn. And it definitely wasn't just about basketball. Because when the most talked about player in women's sports, the one driving record ratings, selling out arenas, forcing networks to rewrite contracts, keeps finding herself minimized inside the very system that should be building around her. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns tell stories. When Team USA announced its latest decisions, most headlines focused on the obvious. Who made it? Who didn't? Who's coaching? Who's returning? It looked routine, safe, professional, normal. But fans didn't react like this was normal. They reacted like something felt off. Again, because this isn't happening in a vacuum. There's history here. There's context. There's tension that's been building quietly for over a year. And if you zoom out far enough, you start to see something much bigger than one tournament. You start to see a power struggle. On one side, you have the institution, decades of tradition, seniority rules, legacy names, a system built on hierarchy, patience, and control. On the other side, you have a generational disruptor, a player who doesn't just score, she shifts markets. She doesn't just win games, she changes financial models. She doesn't just attract fans, she brings an entirely new audience that doesn't play by old rules. And institutions don't always respond well to disruptors. The official story says this is about development, about balance, about experience, about building chemistry the right way. But if that were the whole truth, why does it keep feeling like containment instead of celebration? Why does it feel like every time Caitlin Clark moves forward, something quietly pulls her back? Why did the 2024 situation spark outrage? Why did marketing decisions raise eyebrows? Why do coaching appointments suddenly feel political? Why does every step forward come with an asterisk? You can dismiss one moment. You can explain away two. But when it keeps happening, fans stop asking what and start asking why. And that's where this gets uncomfortable. Because if this isn't about basketball, then what is it about? That's what we're unpacking. And the deeper you look, the less accidental it feels. But to understand what's happening now, you have to go back to where the tension really started. And that takes us to 2024, before there were graphics debates, before coaching speculation, before fans started dissecting press releases like legal documents. There was the moment that split the basketball world in half, the Olympic roster. When the 2024 team was announced, it was framed as business as usual, veteran-heavy, experience-focused, continuity valued. That's how Team USA has historically operated. Loyalty matters, seniority matters, championships matter. But this time was different. Because this time, the most talked about player in the country wasn't on the list. And it wasn't just any rookie. It wasn't a quiet prospect still finding her footing. It wasn't someone riding hype without production. It was Caitlin Clark. At that point, she had already altered the economic landscape of women's basketball. TV ratings were breaking records. Ticket demand was exploding. Merchandise numbers were rewriting expectations. Media coverage was relentless. Even people who had never watched a WNBA game before suddenly had opinions. She wasn't just popular. She was catalytic. And yet, when the Olympic roster dropped, her name wasn't there. The explanation was predictable. Experience, timing, depth, future opportunity. Words that sounded reasonable in isolation. But context changes everything. Because Team USA isn't just about rewarding the past. It's also about building the future. It's about global exposure. It's about representing the next era of the sport. And historically, when generational talents emerge, they're fast-tracked. So fans started asking questions. Not disrespectfully at first, just curiously. How does the biggest draw in women's basketball not make a roster that desperately benefits from viewership growth? How do you leave off the one player casual fans recognize instantly? How do you ignore the momentum wave she was creating? The response from some corners of the basketball world wasn't just dismissive, it was defensive. She hasn't earned it. She needs to wait. Other players paid their dues. And that's where the divide became clear. Because to the institution, this was about maintaining order. But to the fans, it looked like fear of disruption. It wasn't just that she didn't make the team. It was how quickly the narrative shifted from basketball evaluation to cultural commentary. Supporters were labeled overreactive. Critics were labeled jealous. Neutral observers felt like something strange was happening beneath the surface. Then came the numbers. Every game she played in the WNBA that season drew attention far beyond typical league metrics. Road arenas sold out when her team visited. Broadcast windows expanded. Debate shows covered regular season matchups like playoff events. The appetite was obvious, which made the Olympic omission feel less like a performance decision and more like a philosophical one. And that's when the larger question emerged. Was Team USA protecting competitive integrity or protecting hierarchy? Because institutions often struggle when one individual becomes larger than the system itself. When the spotlight shifts from the logo to the person, power dynamics change. Control shifts. Negotiation leverage grows. Narratives become harder to manage. And Caitlin Clark wasn't just becoming a star. She was becoming leverage. The Olympic moment wasn't just a roster decision. It was a signal. A signal that even overwhelming public momentum wouldn't override tradition. A signal that the old guard still sets the tempo. A signal that no one, no matter how transformational, skips the line. And maybe that would have been the end of it. Maybe fans would have accepted it as a tough but understandable choice. Except what happened next didn't calm the narrative. It intensified it. Because instead of fading quietly, Clark's presence only grew louder. The ratings didn't drop. The interest didn't cool. The debates didn't stop. If anything, the snub amplified her mythos. She became the star who wasn't allowed in. And that's a powerful storyline. When she was later included in future USA plans, it should have felt like resolution. Instead, it felt like stage 2. Because now the question wasn't whether she'd be included. The question was how she'd be used. And that's where things started to get complicated. But that's only the surface. Because once you start looking at what happened after 2024, the marketing, the messaging, the coaching alignments, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. And the next piece of this story might be the most revealing of all. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a controversial quote. It wasn't even a game. It was a picture. And sometimes, pictures say more than statements ever could. When USA Basketball released the promotional graphic for the upcoming tournament, it was supposed to be routine. A hype image. A clean rollout. Faces of the team. Energy. Unity. National pride. Just standard marketing. But within minutes, fans noticed something strange. Something subtle, but loud at the same time. Caitlin Clark wasn't centered. In fact, depending on the version circulating, she wasn't prominently featured at all. Now pause for a second. This is the same player who was selling out NBA arenas during WNBA road games. The same player whose highlights were being replayed on platforms that had barely acknowledged women's basketball before. The same name that casual sports fans, not diehards, not analysts, casual fans recognized instantly. And she wasn't front and center? That's when eyebrows started rising. Because marketing isn't random anymore. It's data-driven. It's analytics-heavy. It's optimized down to color choice and eyeline direction. Billion-dollar companies don't accidentally minimize their most recognizable asset. They test everything. Which leads to the uncomfortable question. If she wasn't the focal point, was that intentional? Now, to be clear, the roster was stacked. Elite players. Champions. Veterans with international resumes. No one is questioning their talent. But marketing doesn't operate on resume alone. It operates on attention. And attention follows gravity. Caitlin Clark is gravity right now. When she plays, engagement spikes. When her name trends, algorithms shift. When she posts, traffic follows. That's not opinion. That's measurable impact. So why wouldn't you lead with that? Some defended it immediately. This is about the team, not one player. Fair point. But here's the thing. Historically, Team USA has absolutely leaned into star power when it benefits them. When Diana Taurasi was the face. When Sue Bird was the symbol. When certain players carried narrative weight, marketing followed them. That wasn't considered selfish. It was considered smart branding. So why does it suddenly feel different now? Why does highlighting Clark feel controversial inside certain circles? Because this isn't just about aesthetics. It's about messaging. Marketing communicates hierarchy. It tells the audience who matters most, who represents the era, who carries the torch. And when the most talked about player isn't visually prioritized, it sends a signal, intentional or not. It says, she's here. But she's not the center. That's subtle, but powerful. And fans aren't naive. They've watched the pattern since 2024. They remember the Olympic decision. They remember the tone shifts in interviews. They remember the commentary about earning it and waiting. So when the graphic dropped, it didn't feel isolated. It felt connected. It felt like continuity. And here's where it gets interesting. Casual fans don't dissect depth charts. They don't analyze assistant coach history. They don't debate lineup efficiency. They scroll. And in that scroll window, that 2-second decision whether to care, star recognition matters. If a casual sports fan sees a USA graphic and instantly recognizes Caitlin Clark, they pause. They click. They share. They buy tickets. They tune in. If they don't immediately recognize the faces, they keep scrolling. That's not disrespect. That's consumer psychology, which makes the decision even more puzzling from a business standpoint. Unless the goal wasn't maximizing attention. Unless the goal was stabilizing control. Because here's the tension no one wants to say out loud. When one player becomes too big, institutions get nervous. When the crowd shows up for a name more than a logo, the logo loses leverage. And USA Basketball isn't just a team. It's an institution. Institutions value continuity. They value collective identity. They value the brand above the individual. And Caitlin Clark challenges that balance. She doesn't just fit into the machine. She shifts the machine. So when fans saw that graphic, it wasn't outrage over design. It was recognition of pattern. It was the feeling that every time she rises, something subtly reins her in. Not aggressively, not publicly, but strategically. And that's what made this moment different from 2024. The Olympic snub could be framed as performance-based. This was optics. And optics are chosen. Now, maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was design preference. Maybe it was rotation fairness. But when you stack it next to the history, the questions don't disappear. They multiply. Because if she's the biggest draw in the sport, why does it feel like she's being treated like a supporting character? And that's when attention shifted from the graphic to the bench. Because the next development didn't just raise eyebrows. It raised alarms. And it had everything to do with who would be standing behind her on the sidelines. If the graphic felt subtle, the coaching staff felt deliberate. Because players can control performance. They can't control who controls them. When the coaching names were finalized, most fans skimmed past it. Head coach, assistants, standard structure. That's how it always works. But then one name hit differently. And suddenly, this wasn't just about visibility. It was about environment. Because coaching isn't neutral. It shapes usage. It dictates tempo. It determines who gets freedom and who gets managed. And when you're a generational offensive engine like Caitlin Clark, system fit matters more than anything. So when fans saw familiar coaching ties, especially connected to her recent WNBA experience, the conversation shifted instantly. Not because the coach lacks credentials, not because of resume concerns, but because of context. Clark's rookie WNBA season was turbulent. Historic moments, yes. Record-breaking flashes, absolutely. But also heavy scrutiny. Questions about play style. Debates about shot selection. Criticism about pace. Conversations about whether she should adjust instead of dictate. And at the center of that storm, coaching philosophy. There were stretches where fans felt she was being restrained instead of unleashed. Slowed instead of accelerated. Asked to conform rather than amplify what made her different. Now, whether that criticism is fair or not isn't the core issue here. Perception is. And the perception among a large portion of the fan base was this. She thrives when empowered. She struggles when contained. So when familiar coaching presence followed her into Team USA, a space many assumed would be a reset, the reaction wasn't calm curiosity. It was suspicion. Because Team USA was supposed to be the escape from system friction. A chance to play with elite spacing. A chance to operate at international pace. A chance to build chemistry free from domestic narratives. Instead, it suddenly felt like continuity. And that's when the psychological angle started surfacing. Elite athletes are sensitive to environment. Not emotionally fragile, strategically aware. They understand tone. They feel hierarchy. They know when they're being trusted versus monitored. And when the same voices, the same structural energy, the same philosophical guardrails reappear in a new setting, it doesn't feel like opportunity. It feels like supervision. Now let's be fair. USA Basketball doesn't design rosters around one player's comfort. It builds continuity through trusted pipelines. Coaches rotate through systems. Assistants earn promotions. There's logic behind the structure. But timing matters. Optics matter. And if you were already questioning whether Clark was being fully embraced by the establishment, this didn't calm that narrative. It intensified it. Because here's the uncomfortable layer beneath the surface. If Caitlin Clark were to go to Team USA and explode, truly explode, in a faster, freer international system, it would shift conversations dramatically. It would suggest that maybe her domestic limitations weren't about her ability. Maybe they were about structure. And that kind of narrative ripple doesn't just impact one coach. It impacts philosophy. It impacts reputation. It impacts control. Now, no one would openly admit that fear. But institutions don't operate emotionally. They operate defensively. They protect internal cohesion. They protect hierarchy. They protect narrative stability. And when a player threatens to rewrite the internal script, there are two options: build around her, or regulate her. So the question fans started asking wasn't, is this coach qualified? It was, why this alignment right now? Because Team USA is where reputations are elevated globally. It's where legacies are cemented. It's where players step into mythic territory. And if Clark is the future face of the sport, which ratings, revenue, and engagement all suggest, then how she performs on this stage matters beyond one tournament. It shapes the next decade. So every structural decision around her feels magnified. Every substitution, every minute allocation, every play call, every late-game possession. And when the coaching structure doesn't feel like a fresh start, it feels like oversight. Fans don't see continuity. They see containment. Now here's where it gets even more layered. USA Basketball has always leaned on seniority culture. Respect the veterans. Honor the lineage. Don't skip steps. That philosophy built dominance for years. But generational shifts test old rules. Because Clark isn't a typical rookie. She isn't a quiet prospect waiting for permission. She's a market mover. And when a market mover walks into a room built on seniority, tension is inevitable. Which leads to the next critical question. If the coaches aren't fully ready to build around her, what about the players? Because roster politics might be even more complicated than sideline strategy. And that's where this story stops being subtle and starts becoming structural. This is where things stop being procedural and start becoming personal. Because basketball culture, especially inside Team USA, runs on hierarchy. You don't just walk into that locker room and take over. You don't skip steps. You don't leapfrog veterans. You don't rewrite tradition overnight. At least, that's how it's always been. Team USA was built on continuity. Veterans mentoring the next wave. Players earning minutes over multiple cycles. Respect for gold medal history. A quiet understanding that dominance is maintained through structure, not disruption. That system worked for decades. But here's the problem. Caitlin Clark isn't a normal addition to the pipeline. She doesn't enter quietly. She doesn't arrive unknown. She doesn't build fanfare gradually. She arrives with gravity. And gravity changes rooms. When she steps onto the floor, cameras shift. When she checks into games, volume rises. When she touches the ball, attention spikes. That doesn't just affect opponents. It affects teammates. Now pause here, because this is delicate. The veterans on this roster are elite. Champions. Leaders. Players who've bled for the program. They've earned their medals. They've built this dynasty. But human psychology doesn't disappear just because you wear red, white, and blue. When someone new enters your ecosystem and immediately becomes the center of conversation, whether you like it or not, there's adjustment. Sometimes that adjustment becomes mentorship. Sometimes it becomes tension. Because here's the uncomfortable reality. Caitlin Clark represents stylistic evolution. Deep threes, high pace, transition pressure, logo range, usage dominance. The previous era was precision, half-court control, structured offense, post-dominance, veteran tempo. Neither is wrong, but they are different. And when eras collide, someone has to bend. The question fans are asking isn't whether Clark is talented enough. It's whether the system is flexible enough. Because if the culture demands she slow down, if the veterans expect deference, if the rotation favors experience over momentum, then she's not being integrated. She's being absorbed. And absorption dulls edges. Clark's appeal isn't just her numbers. It's her audacity. The heat-check threes. The skip passes through impossible windows. The willingness to take the shot when everyone expects a swing. That confidence built her brand. That freedom built the ratings surge. That edge built the new fan base. So if she walks into a locker room that quietly expects her to tone it down, what happens? Does she adapt? Or does the room adapt to her? Historically, Team USA has chosen stability. Chelsea Gray, Kelsey Plum, veterans who understand the system. Players who've navigated FIBA tempo and international officiating. Trusted decision-makers. And trust matters. But here's where it becomes complicated. If Clark is used as a secondary option, if she's rotated in short bursts, if she's asked to facilitate more than dictate, the public won't read that as strategy. They'll read it as hierarchy protection. Because fans aren't watching through a neutral lens anymore. They're watching through the memory of 2024, through the marketing optics, through coaching alignments. And when you stack those layers together, it stops feeling isolated. It feels systemic. Now imagine the locker room dynamic. Not hostility, not open conflict, but subtle positioning. Veterans taking leadership roles. Media questions directed differently. Possessions flowing through familiar hands late in games. None of that would be dramatic on its own. But context amplifies everything. Because if Clark dominates early games, pressure builds. If she sits during key stretches, debate explodes. If she defers too much, critics say she's shrinking. If she shoots too much, critics say she's selfish. That's a tightrope no other player on that roster is walking. And that's the difference. Most players are evaluated on performance. Clark is evaluated on symbolism. She symbolizes the future. She symbolizes growth. She symbolizes disruption. And institutions are careful with symbols. Because if the symbol outshines the system, power shifts. That's why fans keep returning to the same quiet question. Is Team USA fully ready for the new era? Or are they trying to slow it down? Because there's a fine line between mentorship and containment, between structure and suppression, between honoring legacy and protecting it. And this tournament might be the first real test of which direction they choose. But here's where it gets even more layered. Because while fans debate culture and hierarchy, there's another force operating behind the scenes. And that force doesn't care about minutes or rotations. It cares about money. And that's where this story becomes bigger than the court. Follow the money. Because when confusion surrounds decisions in professional sports, the explanation usually isn't emotional. It's financial. Caitlin Clark didn't just enter the WNBA as a talented rookie. She entered as a market event. Broadcast negotiations shifted. Arena capacities were reconsidered. Ticket pricing models adjusted. Social media engagement doubled. Corporate sponsors recalibrated activation strategies. Entire franchises changed venues when she visited. That's not hype. That's economic impact. And economic impact changes leverage. When one athlete drives that kind of measurable growth, the ecosystem has two options: empower her, or regulate her influence. Because here's the truth about institutions: they prefer sustainable control over explosive growth. Explosive growth is unpredictable. It shifts bargaining power. It invites outside influence. It creates dependency on one personality. And dependency weakens centralized authority. USA Basketball isn't just about winning games. It's a brand, a global brand. It represents structure, unity, tradition, dominance. The logo must always matter more than the name. But Clark's presence complicates that. When casual fans tune in primarily for her. When viewership spikes correlate directly to her games. When merchandise demand revolves around her jersey. The balance shifts. Suddenly, it's not just Team USA. It's Team USA featuring Caitlin Clark. That distinction may seem small, but in boardrooms it's massive. Because if a single player becomes the primary draw, sponsorship conversations change. Media leverage shifts. Future negotiations center around availability. Control disperses. And institutions rarely welcome that dynamic. Now, this isn't unique to women's basketball. We've seen it before. When a generational talent emerges, one who transcends the sport, governing bodies often hesitate before fully embracing that power. Not publicly, but structurally. They emphasize the collective. They distribute visibility. They avoid centering too much around one figure. It feels balanced, but it also maintains hierarchy. So when fans ask, why not fully lean into Clark? The answer might not be basketball at all. It might be brand preservation. Because here's the tension. Clark represents growth. Massive growth. New audiences. Younger demographics. Higher engagement. More volatile fan bases. But new audiences don't always follow old etiquette. They question decisions. They demand transparency. They challenge veteran privilege. They amplify criticism online. From an institutional standpoint, that's unstable. A quieter audience is easier to manage. A traditional fan base respects hierarchy. A legacy-driven narrative protects continuity. But Clark's audience? They're disruptive. They expect star treatment. They expect visibility. They expect immediate impact. And when those expectations aren't met, they don't shrug. They mobilize, which puts pressure not just on coaching decisions, but on organizational strategy. So if USA Basketball seems hesitant to build entirely around Clark, it might not be fear of her talent. It might be fear of losing narrative control. Because once a player becomes the engine of financial momentum, that player gains leverage. And leverage changes conversations. Contract leverage, scheduling leverage, media leverage, negotiation leverage. If Clark becomes the undisputed face of Team USA and dominates internationally, her influence expands beyond the WNBA. She becomes global, and a global superstar negotiates differently. That doesn't mean there's a conspiracy. It means there's caution. Institutions don't hand over power casually. They phase it in. They test it. They measure stability. And sometimes, they slow it down. So when fans notice the graphic choices, when they analyze the coaching alignments, when they questioned rotation projections, they weren't just reacting emotionally. They were sensing resistance. Resistance to rapid transition. Resistance to full embrace. Resistance to handing the future over before the old guard is ready to release it. Now here's the twist. This strategy carries risk. Because suppressing momentum doesn't eliminate it. It amplifies it. If Clark performs well under restraint, fans get louder. If she's limited, debate intensifies. If she thrives despite containment, the narrative shifts even harder in her favor. In trying to stabilize growth, institutions sometimes create rebellion, and rebellion drives engagement even faster. So the real gamble here isn't whether she makes shots. It's whether Team USA can manage her rise without appearing to obstruct it. Because perception matters. If fans start believing the system is holding her back, that perception spreads. And perception can damage brand equity faster than any loss on the court. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable layer yet. What if this isn't about excluding her? What if it's about humbling her? Because sometimes the strategy isn't erasure. It's calibration. And that possibility changes everything. Not all resistance looks aggressive. Sometimes it looks polite. Sometimes it looks strategic. Sometimes it even looks reasonable. And that's what makes it powerful. Because when fans talk about Caitlin Clark being held back, they're not imagining some dramatic confrontation in a locker room. They're not picturing shouting matches or open hostility. It's quieter than that. It's rotational. It's contextual. It's situational. It's the fourth quarter substitution that feels slightly premature. It's the stretch where the offense doesn't run through her for 5 straight possessions. It's the explanation that sounds logical, but feels incomplete. That's how institutions recalibrate stars. They don't bench them outright. They manage them. Now step into this scenario. Clark checks into a high-stakes international game. The pace is fast. The spacing is better than what she sees in domestic play. She hits 2 deep threes early. The crowd buzzes. Social media explodes in real time. Momentum builds. And then she rotates out. Not because she's playing poorly. Not because she's fatigued. But because the rotation demands balance. On paper, that's normal. In context, it feels loaded. Because when a player carries the weight of cultural transition, every decision feels symbolic. If she sits too long, fans interpret suppression. If she dominates the ball, critics call it selfish. If she defers, commentators question her assertiveness. That's the trap of being generational. You're not evaluated like everyone else. You're evaluated as a thesis statement. And Team USA has a long-standing culture of humility. Respect the veterans. Play within the system. Trust the collective. Those principles built a dynasty. But Clark's rise wasn't built on quiet integration. It was built on audacity. Logo threes. Heat checks. Cross-court lasers. High-usage brilliance. That style doesn't whisper. It roars. So if the system gently nudges her toward moderation, is that development or containment? Now here's the subtle psychological layer. When institutions feel a player's influence expanding rapidly, they often test compliance. Not maliciously, Strategically, will she adjust? Will she defer? Will she accept a secondary role? Will she publicly embrace team first, messaging even if it limits her natural game? Because if she does, the system retains equilibrium. If she doesn't, friction becomes visible. And visible friction threatens brand cohesion. Remember, Team USA's image is unity. Dominance without drama. Excellence without ego. Clark doesn't project ego, but she projects magnitude. And magnitude attracts orbit. The danger isn't her attitude. It's her gravity. If teammates begin leaning toward her tempo, if media narratives center around her performance, if fans demand she close games, the internal power balance shifts. That's why minute distribution becomes political. That's why closing lineups matter more than starting lineups. Because closing moments define hierarchy. Who has the ball with 90 seconds left? Who initiates the final possession? Who absorbs defensive attention? Those choices communicate more than press releases ever will. And here's where the humbling theory enters. Not humiliation. Calibration. When a star ascends too quickly, institutions sometimes reintroduce friction to test resilience. Can she perform without being the sole focal point? Can she thrive under shared spotlight? Can she win within the structure rather than rewriting it? Those are legitimate competitive questions. But they also serve a secondary purpose. They slow myth-making. Because nothing accelerates superstardom like unrestricted dominance on the international stage. If Clark were to go into this tournament and average explosive numbers while visibly steering the team's identity, the narrative would solidify overnight. She wouldn't just be the future. She'd be the present. And that transition might feel too abrupt for a system rooted in continuity. So what's safer? Gradual integration. Shared spotlight. Distributed responsibility. It sounds balanced, but it can also feel strategic. Now imagine the opposite scenario. She thrives despite moderation. She leads in efficiency. She closes games decisively. She silences doubts through performance. At that point, containment fails. Because excellence erases management. And that's the gamble. Trying to subtly regulate a generational force can backfire spectacularly. Because if she overcomes structural resistance, the narrative flips. She's not just talented. She's inevitable. And inevitability shifts power permanently. Which leads to the next question nobody is asking loudly enough. What happens if this backfires? What happens if the attempt to stabilize her rise accelerates it instead? Because that possibility might be the most dangerous outcome of all. Here's the part nobody inside the system wants to admit. This strategy, if it is a strategy, is risky. Not mildly risky. Structurally risky. Because when you try to manage a generational shift instead of embracing it, you're walking a tightrope over a fanbase that's already alert. And this fanbase isn't passive. It's loud. It's data-driven. It tracks minutes. It analyzes shot distribution. It clips substitutions in real time. This isn't 2008. This isn't even 2016. Social media doesn't wait for press conferences anymore. Narratives form during the game. Perception spreads before halftime. So if Clark is rotated out during a hot stretch, if she doesn't close games, if the offense stagnates while she watches from the bench, the reaction won't be quiet. And that's where the gamble intensifies. Because Team USA's dominance has always relied on public trust. Trust that the best players play. Trust that merit determines opportunity. Trust that winning decisions are prioritized over politics. If fans begin questioning that trust, the damage isn't immediate. It's gradual, subtle erosion. Because the Clark audience is different. It includes new viewers, casual viewers, younger viewers, viewers who aren't emotionally tied to the legacy era. If they perceive obstruction, they won't defend the institution. They'll criticize it. And criticism spreads faster than loyalty. Now let's flip the scenario. What if Clark absolutely dominates? What if she forces the system to bend? What if she becomes undeniable? Not just in flashes, but consistently. That creates a different problem. Because then the question becomes, why wasn't this embraced sooner? Why did it take pressure to center her? Why did it feel like resistance instead of celebration? Institutions don't like being seen as reactive. They prefer to appear visionary. So either path carries narrative risk. Limit her, and you alienate her supporters. Unleash her, and you expose the hesitation that came before. There's no neutral outcome anymore. That's the reality of generational change. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Team USA isn't just playing for medals. They're playing for the future of the sport's global identity. The next Olympic cycle. The next broadcast negotiations. The next youth wave inspired by what they see on this stage. Clark's style is magnetic to young players. Deep range, creative passing, fearlessness. That's the blueprint kids mimic in driveways. If that style is visibly restrained at the highest level, the message becomes unclear. Is the future welcomed or moderated? And sports history shows something important. When institutions resist inevitable change, the change doesn't disappear. It accelerates elsewhere. If fans ever feel that Clark's full potential isn't being realized within the USA framework, that conversation expands. It moves toward league autonomy, toward branding independence, toward structural negotiation, because stars with leverage eventually recognize it, and recognition changes everything. Now imagine the worst-case scenario for Team USA. Clark plays limited minutes. Her usage dips. The team wins comfortably, but the energy feels muted. Fans feel disconnected. Engagement doesn't spike the way it could. The gold medal remains, but the momentum fades. That's not catastrophic in the short term, but long term, momentum is currency. And right now, Clark is momentum. Suppressing momentum doesn't preserve stability. It delays evolution. And delayed evolution often costs more than immediate adaptation. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable possibility of all. What if this isn't about suppressing her? What if it's about forcing her to prove something? Because sometimes institutions don't resist stars. They test them. And tests, when public, can redefine everything. What if we've been looking at this the wrong way? What if this isn't containment, but calibration? Because there's another interpretation here. One that's less dramatic, but maybe even more intense. What if Team USA isn't trying to suppress Caitlin Clark? What if they're trying to see if she can withstand the weight of being the future? Because there's a difference between being popular and being inevitable. Popularity is loud. Inevitability is quiet. Popularity trends. Inevitability endures. And international basketball isn't the WNBA. It isn't college. It isn't built around storylines. It's built around pressure. Different rules. Different spacing. Different officiating. Veterans who've mastered FIBA tempo for years. In that environment, reputation doesn't matter. Execution does. So maybe this entire situation, the hierarchy, the minute management, the shared spotlight, isn't a conspiracy. Maybe it's a filter. Can she adapt without losing identity? Can she coexist without shrinking? Can she dominate without demanding? Because the truth is, being the face of Team USA requires more than scoring. It requires diplomacy. It requires composure. It requires navigating veterans who've been here before. The Olympics and World Cups aren't just about talent. They're about trust. And trust inside that program has historically been built slowly. Sue Bird didn't walk in and control the room overnight. Diana Taurasi didn't bypass veteran presence. Even legends integrated before they inherited. Clark's rise has been different. It's been accelerated, which means the internal evaluation might be different too. If she can thrive inside a structured, veteran-heavy system, if she can command respect without demanding it, if she can close games without disrupting chemistry, then she doesn't just become a star. She becomes foundational. And foundations are harder to question. So maybe the system isn't resisting her. Maybe it's stress testing her. Because once Team USA fully centers a player as the face of a generation, there's no undo button. That commitment shapes marketing. It shapes development pipelines. It shapes youth identity. It shapes the next decade. You don't make that shift lightly. You verify it. You examine how she handles reduced minutes. You observe how she responds to deferring. You monitor how she reacts to not being the immediate focal point. Not to humble her, but to measure her. And here's where it becomes fascinating. Clark has always responded to doubt with escalation. Left off the Olympic team, she answered with record-breaking viewership. Criticized for shot selection, she answered with logo daggers. Questioned about physicality, she adjusted and kept producing. Pressure hasn't diminished her. It's amplified her. So if this tournament is a test, it might backfire in spectacular fashion. Because if she absorbs the hierarchy, if she thrives within the structure, if she proves adaptable without losing edge, then there's no more debate, no more seniority shield, no more wait your turn argument, no more hesitation. She becomes the unavoidable centerpiece. And that's permanent, which raises a dangerous possibility for the old guard. if she passes the test decisively. There's no slowing the era shift anymore. And era shifts are uncomfortable. They don't politely ask for permission. They redefine rooms. They rearrange leadership. They rewrite marketing campaigns. They alter locker room dynamics. So whether this is resistance or testing, the outcome leads to the same destination: acceleration. Because either she proves them wrong, or she proves them right in a way that still makes her central. There's no version of this where she disappears quietly. And that's the irony. The more structured the environment, the more measured the exposure, the more cautious the integration. The bigger the explosion if she thrives anyway. Which brings us to the final and most important question. What happens after this tournament? Because whatever unfolds here won't stay here. It will shape the next Olympic cycle, the next media negotiation, the next generation of players who decide who they want to emulate. And the institution might not control that decision as much as it thinks. Now the future isn't theoretical. It's approaching fast. And it won't wait for comfort. This tournament isn't just about qualifying games. It's not just about rotations. Not just about starting lineups. Not just about whether she gets 18 minutes or 28. It's about narrative control. Because history doesn't remember depth charts. It remembers turning points. And this feels like one. Every generation of basketball has a moment when the torch isn't politely handed over, it's seized. Magic didn't wait. Jordan didn't wait. Kobe didn't wait. LeBron didn't wait. They didn't disrespect veterans. They didn't sabotage culture. They simply performed at a level that made resistance impossible. That's how eras change. Not through committee approval. Through undeniability. Right now, women's basketball is standing at that edge. The ratings spike wasn't subtle. The attention shift wasn't minor. The economic impact wasn't incremental. It was explosive. And explosive growth forces decisions. Does the institution accelerate with it? Or attempt to regulate the speed? Because once you officially center Caitlin Clark as the face of Team USA, there's no walking it back. She becomes the marketing focal point, the youth development symbol, the international ambassador. The player future rosters are built around. That's a 10-year commitment. And institutions don't make 10-year commitments impulsively. They observe. They test. They measure public reaction. They evaluate locker room stability. They study sustainability. But here's the part that makes this moment so fragile. Public momentum doesn't pause for internal evaluation. Fans aren't waiting for gradual rollout. They're not studying seniority pipelines. They're not concerned with legacy pacing. They see the future. And they want it now. If this tournament ends with Clark clearly driving the identity of the team, whether statistically or symbolically, the conversation ends. She becomes the era. But if it ends with ambiguity, if her role feels limited, if veterans visibly dominate the narrative, the debate intensifies, and prolonged debate damages cohesion. Because uncertainty is dangerous for branding. You either embrace the transition, or you fuel speculation that you're resisting it. And speculation spreads faster than strategy. Now zoom out even further. The 2028 Olympic cycle looms ahead. That's not far away. The player who defines the next Olympics will shape endorsement flows, global youth participation, media storytelling, and cultural alignment. If Clark enters that cycle already established as the unquestioned leader of Team USA, the marketing runway is enormous. If she enters still navigating hierarchy debates, the narrative remains fractured. And fractured narratives weaken authority. That's why this tournament matters beyond wins and losses. It's a preview, a signal, a directional arrow. Because if she thrives under scrutiny, the institution gains clarity. If she's restrained and fans revolt, the institution faces pressure. Either way, neutrality disappears. And once neutrality disappears, power shifts. The irony is this. Clark doesn't need Team USA to maintain relevance. Her domestic impact has already proven that. But Team USA benefits enormously from fully aligning with her momentum. That's the balancing act. She brings attention. They bring legacy. Together, it's explosive growth. Misaligned, it's tension. And tension can either refine something or fracture it. This moment feels like refinement. But refinement requires trust. Trust from veterans. Trust from coaches. Trust from the institution. Trust from the fans. If any of those fracture, the story doesn't end here. It escalates into the next cycle. And the next. Because generational shifts don't reverse. They solidify. Which leads us to the final layer of this entire conversation. What does Caitlin Clark do next? Because for all the discussion about institutions, hierarchy, and politics, the most powerful force in this equation is still the player herself. And how she responds could define everything. For all the talk about systems, for all the debates about hierarchy, for all the speculation about coaching strategy, veteran influence, branding caution, and institutional pacing, there's one thing nobody inside that building can fully control: Caitlin Clark with the ball. Because at the end of the day, no graphic dictates range. No rotation schedule erases instinct. No hierarchy suppresses confidence if it's authentic. When the game starts, structure fades, and talent takes over. That's the part institutions sometimes forget. You can manage narrative. You can adjust minutes. You can shape messaging. But you can't script inevitability. If she walks into this tournament and plays freely, not recklessly, but freely, everything shifts. If she hits those deep transition threes and the crowd erupts. If she threads those impossible passes that make defenders freeze. If she controls tempo in a way that feels effortless. The hierarchy discussion disappears. Because performance ends arguments faster than commentary ever could. And here's the twist that makes this entire situation fascinating. Pressure has always made her sharper. Left off the Olympic team? She didn't fold. Questioned about physicality? She adapted. Criticized for turnovers? She adjusted. Every time the narrative tightened around her, she didn't shrink. She expanded. Which means if this tournament is resistance, it fuels her. If it's a test, it motivates her. If it's hesitation, it challenges her. And challengers are dangerous when they don't doubt themselves. The institution might be cautious. The veterans might be protective. The coaches might be strategic. But Clark doesn't operate from fear. She operates from belief. Belief in her range. Belief in her reads. Belief in her ability to change momentum in seconds. And belief is contagious. If she commands the floor, not through ego, but through impact, teammates follow. Because winning overrides politics. It always has. Now imagine the closing minutes of a tight international game. Score close. Possession critical. Crowd tense. The ball swings to the top of the arc. Does she take it? Does she rise from distance without hesitation? Does she make the moment undeniable? If she does consistently, the debate ends. Because institutions don't suppress sustained excellence. They eventually build around it. And if that happens here, in this setting, on this stage, then 2024 becomes a footnote. The graphic becomes irrelevant. The coaching speculation becomes noise. The hierarchy dissolves into evolution. Because evolution doesn't ask for permission. It forces adaptation. And maybe that's what this moment really is. Not suppression. Not sabotage. Not politics. Transition. Messy. Uncomfortable. Inevitable. Every dynasty faces it. Every era shift tests it. The difference is whether the transition feels forced or embraced. Right now, we're watching that decision unfold in real time. This isn't just about whether Caitlin Clark plays 20 minutes or 30. It's about whether Team USA accelerates into the future or cautiously tiptoes toward it. But here's the reality nobody can escape. The future isn't waiting. The ratings won't rewind. The momentum won't pause. The new fans won't quietly disappear. And if Clark performs the way many believe she will, there won't be room for hesitation anymore. Only clarity. So the real question isn't whether Team USA refused to add Caitlin Clark. The real question is whether they're ready to fully hand her the keys once she proves she deserves them. Because if history tells us anything, when a generational talent rises, resistance doesn't stop the era shift. It just makes the moment louder. And this moment, it's getting louder by the day. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just a roster debate. It's a turning point. And we're going to keep tracking every rotation, every decision, every signal they send from here forward. Because this story isn't ending after one tournament. It's just beginning. If you want deep breakdowns like this, the layers behind the headlines, the politics behind the press releases, the real implications nobody's saying out loud, make sure you subscribe. Because the next chapter of this era shift, it's going to unfold fast. And you're going to want to see it in real time.